Hi, my name is Lee Stranahan, and welcome to Lightwave Essentials Part 1. In this tape, we're going to be covering the basics of setting up scenes, creating motion paths that work, working effectively and avoiding problems, and also into such sort of unknown things like setting up spline paths properly, using the motion graph, and other things. These are the real basic building blocks of working in Lightwave, and if you can understand these things, we'll be setting up a scene for you during the course of the tape, you'll really be able to create some pretty impressive scenes. We've got a lot of work to do. Let's get started right away. All right, here we are on the main switcher screen, and let's just start by opening Lightwave up by clicking on the 3D button. And here we are in Lightwave. Now what we want to do is we want to start by giving you a basic lay of the land here and talk about the way the program's set up. The analogy I like to use for Lightwave is that in Lightwave it's like you're dealing with a miniature sound stage that's inside your computer. You've got your camera, you've got your lights, and you've got your objects, and you can just move these around the same way you'd move models around. Now, the problem is when you start up Lightwave, there's no objects. You've got your camera and your light in there, as you'll see in a moment, but you're not filming anything. So, a soundstage with no objects on it is not the most exciting thing. Let's start by showing you, again, just basically the geometry of the program, and then start to add some objects. These buttons up here will bring up different menus. The scene menu, objects menu, surfaces, images, lights, camera, effects, record, option, and this button here will enter the modeler program. We'll save that for another tape. Now, all of these menus up here bring up a lot of buttons, and if you're not familiar with the program and you load it up for the first time, when we go through all those menus and you see all the buttons, you might have the tendency just to shut the VCR off and hide your head under the covers. Don't do that, because there's a lot of buttons here, but the basics of the program are just a few buttons, and once you know those buttons, you know about 90% of the program. There's one hint that will help you. You do not need to know what all of these buttons do. There's a lot of these buttons that you may never use, or you may use one or two times for special occasions, and you're going to see that really a lot of the things that we do are just based on a few basic skills. Once you get over this initial sort of learning hump, then it's all downhill from there, although you really never stop learning in Lightwave. So again, don't worry about all the buttons. We're just going to cover the ones that are essential here. Now, let me turn this off. You see, there's two ways I can turn off these menus, by the way, either by re-clicking on the button or hitting continue at the bottom. And let's go to the objects menu and load an object. We'll go to load objects, and let's go to the tutorials directory so we can move up and down by using this slider or these buttons. Click on tutorial, and then I will click on New Tech logo. That's selected here. We'll just click on OK, continue, and here is our object. Now, one of the problems with Lightwave or any 3D program is that you are looking at three-dimensional space. You're trying to picture three-dimensional space on a monitor that's basically two-dimensional. For that reason, you have different views that you can select between, and if you think about it, it makes perfect sense to select between the views. If this were a real soundstage and you were setting up your camera, your lights, and your objects and actors on this stage, you wouldn't just say, okay, well, I'm going to look at the actors only through the camera. And for that same reason, you can set up your soundstage here in the computer from any number of different perspectives. So let's find out how to change those views. And let's go up here. This is the view menu, and this gives us 6 different views. And again, you can see they're labeled XY, XZ, ZY, perspective, light, and camera. Now the first 5 views, all of these, are just setup views. These are to help you set up your world. And you'll see as the tape continues the different ways we'll use these. I'll switch between them depending upon what I'm trying to do at various points. But the most important view, the view you have to remember that is the most important view, is the camera view, because this is what the computer is going to actually draw. And this is the camera view. Now, one of the problems is that Lightwave defaults when it comes up to this perspective view. And so a lot of people just start setting up their scene from this perspective view. This is not what the camera is going to see. So you want to make sure before you render to just check out the scene from the camera viewpoint. Now, there are keyboard shortcuts in Lightwave, and I'm a big believer in keyboard shortcuts, as you will know if you watch these tapes. And you'll hear me talk about keyboard equivalents all the time. In Lightwave, the way to find out what the keyboard equivalents are is just great. You hit the help key at any point, the help key on the keyboard here, and by hitting the help key, it brings up a list of all the keyboard shortcuts that are available to you at that point. Now, one thing I like about Lightwave's help menus is that if you're in another menu, for instance here, and you hit the help key, it brings up a different list of the keyboard shortcuts that are currently available to you. In other words, these are the only keyboard shortcuts you can use when you have this window open. So again, that's a pretty nice feature. What you'll find out here is when we hit the help key that the F1 through F6 keys, these first 6 keys, change your views. And you'll see instead of clicking here, we can also just use the function keys. And there's good reasons to do this. There's good reasons to get in the habit. And one of them is sometimes you're moving objects around in this window. If you want to quickly go to another view, you don't have to move over here, then switch back, and move over and then switch back. You can just zip around using the keys here. Now let's talk about these first 3 views, X, Y, X, Z, Z, Y. These are really front, top, and side. The way I think of these is front, top, side. And in fact, in the help menu, you see it says front, top, side. But here, it's mystical geometrical designs. So just remember front, top, side for those first 3 views. Again, the perspective view is a movable view. This lets you change around in a 3-dimensional perspective. The light view actually puts you inside the can. It actually puts you inside to see exactly where the light is. And when we talk about lighting later, you'll see that's very, very important. And again, the camera view shows us what the camera is changing. Now, if you want to change these views, the first 4 views, the front, top, side, and perspective views, you have to change by selecting view as your current item. The other views, light and camera, the only way to change those views is to actually move the light or move the camera. And that really does make sense. If you move the camera, obviously what the camera sees is going to be different. Same thing for the light. So let's talk about these edit items. These first 4 here, front, top, side, and perspective, if we have our edit item selected as view, this means when we move the mouse, what's it going to affect? Well, the view. And how's it going to affect it? Well, in perspective mode, we have 3 options for our mouse. Our mouse can control the move, rotate, or zoom factor. And the way Lightwave works is it controls any of these attributes one at a time. So with move chosen, you see that's highlighted. We move over this window, and I'm going to hold the left mouse button down and move it forward, move it backwards, and you can see this is changing our perspective on the 3-dimensional world. It's just changing our view. Move it right or left, and it moves it right or left. Now we have 2 mouse buttons, the left and the right. And you'll notice that so far I'm not moving up or down at all. I'm just moving forward, backward, and left to right. If I hold the right mouse button down, that will move us up and down. And you've got really 3 dimensions, your X, Y, and Z. And there's no way that with a mouse that's moving basically left, right, or up or down, you can control all 3 of those at one time. That's why the second mouse button comes in handy here. Now, since we brought this up, X, Y, and Z, let's talk about, this is Geometry 101, harken back to high school. Just remember that X is left to right, Y is straight up and down, and Z is considered going forward or backwards into the camera. And so when you're moving around any of these dimensions, this is the way we talk about it, is X, Y, and Z. Now, the next thing we can do is we can rotate this view, and we'll just click on Rotate as our mouse function. And you'll see instead of X, Y, and Z, we have heading, pitch, and bank. Heading controls which way something is facing. So you can think of this as turning around a facing. Pitch is rotating forwards or backwards. And bank is moving like a bank of an airplane, left to right. And I'm controlling bank with the right mouse button. So you can see heading and pitch are left, bank is right. Finally, we can control the zoom factor, and this is not the zoom factor for the camera. This is how zoomed in you are from just this view. Now, the other views here, front, top, and side, you'll notice are very similar. They have move and zoom factor, but they don't have rotate. And that's because a side view is always a side view. If you took the side view and you rotated it around, well, it would be the front view then. So it doesn't give you the option of rotating it. If you want to do something like that, just use perspective view. And again, one of the questions people often have is, well, How do you actually use these views? Why would you ever go to top view or side view? And again, the answer comes up when you start to get into a project. You'll see there's points when you're setting up a scene when you'll need to go to side view to make sure everything is set up properly. So that's the way we move around using these controls. And again, you'll see zoom factor is X, Y, or Z. One other thing that I'll point out at this point that you don't really use too much in views is as we're moving things around, notice right here in the lower right-hand corner, this little box right here, right now it's aim point. But you see, as I move around, it's changing my X, Y, and Z coordinates. Same thing for rotate. When I move around, changing our heading, pitch, and bank coordinates, and those coordinates are shown in degrees. So let's just go to our camera view here for a moment, and now let's start moving our object around. To do that, we need to select Object as our current edit item, and you'll notice when I click on Object, the object becomes highlighted. It's pretty straightforward because now we only have one object loaded into the scene, but this is the object that is selected. And it's shown right here as our selected item, the NewTek logo. You'll notice right here, by the way, that if we change to View as our edit item, our current selected item becomes View. Let's go back to Object. And you'll see that we have Move, Rotate, which we had before for our view, Size and Stretch, and also Move Pivot Point. Let's take these in order. Moving works just the same way it did for our views, except now you can see just the objects moving around. Left mouse button moves you forwards and backwards. Remember, that's the Z-axis. Or left and right. Remember, that's X. And then right mouse button moves you up and down or moves you in the Y-axis. And one of the things I found that throws people, particularly if you haven't grown up playing video games, is people get thrown by just the perspective, how you're actually looking at things here. Now, I can understand that because if you didn't grow up used to video games and these little computer images coming towards you, this can be confusing. I've seen people, for instance, who want to know, well, how do you make things smaller? And to me, it's pretty obvious because I blew up blowing things up with quarters. But on the other hand, if you're new to computers, this will throw you. So let me explain this with a real-world thing here. I'm going to bring this forward I'm going to move this over to the side a little bit. And then I'm going to bring it forward on just the Z-axis. Now, the way I can do it on just the Z is to turn off everything but Z. So X and Y are turned off, Z is turned on, and now if I try to move it left and right, it's not working. Right mouse button doesn't do anything. We're just moving it forward on the Z-axis. Now watch, however. Watch as I bring it forward. See, it seems to be moving it to the right. It's not just moving it forward, it's moving it to the right. Well, no. That's not what's really happening. What's happening is, it's almost as though if I had this object, I put it over to the side of view, I'm going to move my arm just straight forward towards the camera, and what's going to happen is it's going to look a little bit like it's extending off to the left. It's not. All that's happening is I'm just moving it straight forward, but because of perspective, it looks like it's moving off to one side. Now, if this doesn't throw you, then you grew up playing video games. If this does throw you, then this hopefully will explain it to you. What's important to understand is the object really is just moving forwards here, even though from our perspective view it looks like it's moving off to the side. And you can see that if we go to the top view, for instance, it's just moving forward. So let me just answer the basic question I raised before. Well, how do you make something smaller? Well, you move it farther back into the distance. If you want to make something look bigger, you move it closer. Now, that's generally true. There's ways, you'll see in just a second here, that we can actually resize the object, but usually I treat this like I would things in the real world, where if somebody's filling up too much of the frame, you'd say to them, take a step back. So it's the same thing here. Okay, let's turn back on X and Y so we can move it in all those dimensions. And let's quickly cover rotate. And I'm turning off everything but heading here. Again, this is our heading, moving the object around the heading. If you want to reset an object to its original 0 direction, see right now here it's 3.2 degrees, you use the reset button, and you'll notice it resets it back to 0 here. Here is pitch, and here is bank. And again, this is right mouse button. Now, reset, let me talk about that for 1 second. We've covered it for split second there. But here's another important thing to know about reset. First off, reset works on whatever object, light, camera, whatever edit item you have here. Could be view or bone as well. But it works on whatever edit item you have here and with whatever mouse function you have selected. So in other words, if I have an object moved up here, rotated this way, and I were to click on reset, well, right now it's got the object selected, rotate selected, and all three of these are on, so it's going to reset the rotation on all three axes, heading, pitch, and bank. And that's what it does. You can see it's 0, 0, 0 down here right now. Now, on the other hand, if I were to have, for instance, camera chosen as our current edit item, and I were to hit reset, well, the object seems to have vanished, and that's because it's reset the camera to the middle 0, 0, 0 position. The camera has moved from its original position. Same thing if I were to be in rotate now for the camera. If I hit reset, it just changes the camera's rotation. So it's important to know that reset works with whatever edit item you have and whatever mouse function. Another important thing to know is that if we turn off, for instance, pitch and bank here, and I hit reset, it will just change it on heading. You notice that the pitch has not been affected. And this is very, very handy. When we get into set up a scene later, we'll show you how that can be very, very useful. All right, let's turn these back on. And the way size works is size affects all three axes, and this is actually just rescaling the object, making it bigger or smaller without actually moving it. If we go to a top view here, you'll see that the object's staying in one place, but it's getting bigger and smaller. Now, size works on all three axes at the same time. You notice that these numbers are moving together. Let's go to our camera view here. Let's just move this guy down a little bit so we can see it easier. Whereas stretch only affects whichever axis you want, X, Y, or Z. It's the same thing as before. Hold the left mouse button down, move forward. You're affecting the Z axis. You notice the object is gaining depth. Move it left and right, changes the X axis. Right mouse button changes the Y axis. And again, if you've done a lot of stretching here, reset is really helpful to get it back to normal. Now, what move pivot point does is it changes the axis around which the object rotates. And to really show you that, let me go to rotate, reset everything, and just rotate it around heading. You notice right now it's rotating around this middle point right here. It's like it's rotating around the middle of the object. And that's because this is the pivot point, and it's for this object in the center of the object. Now, if we go to move pivot point, let me just reset our rotation. Move pivot point will actually let us move where that point is. We'll move it out to here now. Now when we go to rotate, and again, we're just rotating around heading. Notice the way it's moving? Again, it rotates around the X. There's two things here, an X and a cross. We'll come to what the cross means in a little bit, but it rotates it around that X. Let's reset that pivot point. We'll just reset our rotation first. And we'll reset it. If we move the pivot point up, away from the object, and I'm using the right mouse button to move it up on the Y-axis here. This is now the pivot point. And what you'll find is when we rotate it on heading, well, it still seems to be rotating around the middle. That's because it's still centered here. You see the pivot point is still centered on this point. However, when we go to rotate it on pitch, for instance, watch this, boom. So it just rotates it around that new pivot point. Now, the object's pivot point is normally set in Modeler. There's a few reasons why you might want to change it in Lightwave. One of them is if you want to just temporarily, just for the purposes of one scene, just one layout here in Lightwave, change where the pivot point is. This is very, very handy to be able to use. Now, one thing you'll notice is we had an error request here that came up, and if we try to move the pivot point now, as soon as I click on Move Pivot Point, see it says the object's rotation and scale should be reset before moving the pivot point. This is a suggestion. It doesn't force you to do it. But the thing is, by trying to move the pivot point now, you see when I move it, it's changing the object in weird directions. The reason you want to have that rotation and scale reset to the normal position, or when you're moving a pivot point around, if the object is already rotated, it's going to be very strange. As it moves the pivot point, it's going to actually have to change the rotation too. So the best way to change the pivot point is when the object is just first loaded into the scene, set up in a normal position. So let's just reset our pivot point and reset our rotation. Okay, now let's talk about moving our light and camera. We'll talk about bones a little bit later. Our light, again, you'll see that shows up as soon as we click on light, and we'll explain why that was invisible before, just when we talk about our options down here later. But the important thing to know for right now is that the light isn't visible normally until you select it. Then you have two functions, move and rotate. And again, if we want to see what the light's seeing here, we can go to the light perspective. And you'll notice in the light perspective, when we have light selected as our edit item, we rotate the light around. This is what the light's seeing. From the camera perspective, it looks like this. Okay, and finally, let's go to the camera as our edit item. And you have two options there, move and rotate. And again, the constrain options here, turning off X, Y, Z, or heading, pitch, and bank, are very, very handy. A good use for that is, let's say if you wanted to make it just like a tripod where you want to lock off one axis, so you just want to pan the camera, well, it's pretty easy to do. You just turn off everything but heading. Let me reset this here. Turn off everything but heading, and just rotate around. There's two other things we want to discuss before we finish talking about changing the views and moving objects. And that's using the numeric input and the center option. So let me just reset things here. And let's first talk about numeric input. So far we've been moving everything around with the mouse. And this is very, very useful because it's a very, very interactive way to move things around. But sometimes you need to be a little more exact. And let's go to rotation here to talk about that at first. Let's say I wanted this object to spin around 360 degrees on its heading. Well, I'll turn off everything but heading. I'm going to watch this window. I'm just moving the mouse until it gets to 360 degrees. Boom, there we go. 360 degrees. If I wanted to spin the object around twice, well, we'd move it to 720 degrees. But let's just say, for purposes of argument, I need it 3 times. See all the fun we get to have here, just moving the mouse around. It's more like a game, really, than an application almost at this point. Can you get the number and how quickly? Well, there's absolutely no reason to do this. You've got numeric input, and if you need to get something to exact position, for instance 360 degrees, it's a lot quicker to type the numbers in than it is to try to move the mouse around and try to fudge it into place there. So let's talk about how we do that. By clicking on numeric input, and again, this works very similar to the way reset and center work. It works with whatever item you have selected and with whatever mouse function you have selected. So if I were to hit numeric input here, it would bring up the numeric input for our object's rotation. And there it is. If we want to change it to 360 degrees, we just type in 360 degrees. Now you'll notice that there's a space here in the cursor between 360 and 108, etc., etc. If I just hit the Enter key, you'll notice it gets rid of the old value and replaces it with the new one. Now I'm going to take a brief detour here and just talk about keyboard input, because I think this is one of the things that really messes people up. I've seen this a lot when people are first working with Lightwave, is things don't go the way they thought they would go, and often it's just a simple matter of they didn't enter the right values or they weren't working with these requesters in the most efficient way possible. So let me show you a couple tricks here, a couple keyboard tricks that make working with these requesters a lot easier. So here's thing number 1. You go into numeric input. The cursor is automatically right at a position here where if I just type in a number, for instance 24, and hit enter, that new value is automatically replaced. What I don't have to do is if I hit numeric input, I don't have to click in here. A lot of people, they just are in the habit. Numeric input, they figure they got to click in here. Then they start to type, or they click over a little bit, or on top of a number. You notice if I hit 24 now, because there's no space between here, it enters this incredibly gigantic number. This will be bad. Now there's also a couple of keyboard equivalents that if you need to clear out a menu, make your life much easier. Holding down the left Amiga key, the key to the immediate left of the spacebar, and hitting X clears out the requester. If you've got a number put in there already, holding down Shift and hitting the left arrow moves you to the beginning of that number. Hitting the right arrow moves you to the end. And if I'm here and I hold down Shift and hit backspace, it will delete everything from this position on over. Watch this. That's all gone. And again, that's very, very handy. Same thing with our old Shift Delete. It deletes everything from the cursor on out. So the important thing to remember is when you enter these numeric values, just type in the number you want, hit enter, and you'll notice it does the same thing here for pitch. I never have to click the mouse in here. I'll type in 90 degrees on pitch, and I'll leave bank where it is. When I hit enter again, it's going to be the same as hitting OK. It closes us out of the requester, and here we are, 360, 90, 0. Now if I want to change it, the really quick way is to use the keyboard shortcut. For numeric input, that's N. So N, 45 degrees. I'll enter 21.12 for pitch, and I'll enter 64.025 for bank. There we go, exactly what we want. So again, this makes entering these values a lot easier. And again, if you're not familiar with the Amiga or just computers in general, you might practice around till you get the hang of entering values in these requesters. Okay, this is numeric for rotate, and we can do the same thing for any of these values. We go to move, we can move this to an exact position. We'll hit N for numeric. We'll make it 2 meters in the X direction and 1 meter in the Y direction, and there it is. And you can do that for size, stretch, move, pivot point. In fact, any of these values can be entered through numerics. And again, there's a lot of times when it's much, much easier. Okay, now let's talk about centering. Centering is similar to reset. In fact, the buttons are right next to each other on the requester here. Reset and center in the same position. But what they do is actually very different. We've shown reset a little bit. Let's just go to our top view and do a reset on this object. You'll notice what it does is it moves it to the center here of this grid. Let's talk about this grid for a second. This grid is really a three-dimensional representation of where the center of our universe is. And let me go to our view and just zoom ourselves out a bit. And here is the grid. By the way, another good keyboard equivalent to know here is for zoom factor. Instead of using zoom, use the comma or period keys to zoom you in and out. Just move back to move. And you'll see I can use that from any position here. You notice again, if we have the object moved over here, we reset it, it moves to the center. Now, this is different from what center does. If we hit center, watch what it does. You'll notice it didn't move the object over to this point. It actually moved the whole universe over. Well, in case you weren't aware of it, you can't move the whole universe. So since it wasn't moving the whole universe, what's it doing? It kind of looks like it's doing that. What it's really doing is it's adjusting our view on the universe. So, from any of the first 4 views, front, top, side, or perspective, remember those X, Y, X, Z, ZY views, or perspective, when you hit center, it centers whatever edit item you currently have selected. So, if we select our camera as our current edit item, click on center, you notice our camera is now in the center of our perspective, front, top, and side views, all of these. It is not, however, in the center of the light view or the camera view. And the reason for that is because this only moves the views. And remember, the only way to change what the light or camera sees is by actually moving the light or camera. So center can be very, very handy if you need to find an object's position. Just move quickly to that one object. Whereas reset, since it actually moves the objects, is good for fixing a motion. Okay, since we're talking about motions, let's start to set up some motions here. And the most important concept in Lightwave, probably, the basic concept, it's very, very important to understand, is keyframing. And keyframing is just a way of moving an object someplace and telling it to stay there. We've done a lot of movement so far. We've moved the object, rotated it, sized it, moved the camera. But the fact is, the computer doesn't remember any of this. That's because we haven't created any keyframes. And in fact, just to show you I'm not lying, we will go back to switcher here. Just exit back to the main switcher. re-enter, and back to normal. So everything is back where it was when we first started the program and loaded the object. So, in order to keep it in position, you have to do a keyframe. And keyframing, I think of it sort of like dog training. It's you put the object where you want it, and by creating a keyframe, you're basically saying, stay. I want you to stay there. And I've got a couple rules for keyframing that I think will make your life a lot easier, particularly if you're just using the program. Now, these are really more principles than rules. There are occasionally areas where I might break the rules that I'm going to tell you here, but boy, they're really rare. They're the exception, about 99.999% of the cases, than the rule here. So let me give you those. Here's the way I create a keyframe. First off, I am at the frame I want. My current frame is 0, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a start position for this object. So I move the object where I want it, in this case in the back maybe, and up. Maybe rotate it back a little bit. I'll rotate it on pitch. There we are at 0. And okay, I want it to stay there. So I create a keyframe. Now, here's how quickly you can create a keyframe if you use keyboard equivalents. This is me creating a keyframe. That was me hitting the return key twice. And if you listen to that, that's pretty quick. And I usually work with 2 hands on the computer. I have one hand, I'm right-handed, so I have one hand on the mouse, and I have my other hand sort of hovering over the keyboard, waiting to strike at a keyboard shortcut as soon as I can. And this one I use a lot, which is I have my hand here ready to do a return. So the idea is I move the object where I want it. As soon as I'm happy with its position. Now what you'll see here on the screen is this little white cross up here. This is the current keyframe. And you'll notice when I move the object, the keyframe stays there until I create a new one. Then it moves to this new position. Now, that window's going by pretty quickly when I create a keyframe, and there's a reason. I never change the default options here, and these are my rules on keyframing. First off, let's take a look at what the options are. See, it says frame, and the frame is 0. Well, I always leave the frame wherever it is. And I'll talk about the reason that works in just one second here. Here's the really important one to me. Create key for selected items, and you have 3 choices here: selected, all items, selected I'm in descendants. Okay, I have a rule on this, and here's the rule. Always use selected items, always, always, always. Never use either of the other ones, never, ever, never, ever. If you get in the habit of always creating a keyframe for a selected item, your life will be much better. So what's the difference? What's the difference between creating a key for selected items or versus all items? Well, when you create a key for a selected item, it creates a keyframe for only what you have chosen. In this case, just the object, just the logo. If you create it for all items, it's going to create a keyframe for every item in the scene, which is every object, every light, and your camera, all at once. You don't want that. And you will mess yourself up very badly if you start doing that. And the thing is, because I can create a keyframe so quickly, it's really just hitting a key twice. Well, there's no slowdown in moving an object, creating a keyframe, and it keeps me much more mentally focused here. So again, the way I work is move an object where I want it, keyframe. Then pick another object, move that where I want it, keyframe. It's just that easy. So get in the habit, just use that. Now, the thing here about the frame is, if I change my current frame to, let's say, 30, when I hit this, the return key, to create the keyframe, you notice my current frame is 30. Therefore, I always go to a frame first. And the way I think about this is if I want to create an animation that's 30 frames long, and I want to start the object here at 0, and then have it here at 30. Well, first I'll go to that position in time. So I'll go to frame 0, create a keyframe, move it where I want it, create a keyframe. Then I will go to frame 30, move it where I want it, create a keyframe. So I'm at frame 30, keyboard shortcut to change your current frame, hit the F key, notice that brings up a cursor. I don't need to click or anything. If I want to go to frame 60, 60, enter. I am now at frame 60. Let me go back to 30 here. F, 30, enter. Now, I move the object where I want it. If that's where I want it to be at frame 30, create a keyframe. That's it. That's all you do. So the two rules here are always go to the frame first. If you want to create a keyframe for an object at frame 45, go to frame 45, move the object, then create the frame. And always use selected items, never use anything else. Okay, now another thing that I do is I will set up my animations here. If I want to start at frame 0, go to frame 30, and then move to frame, let's say, 15 in a different position there, so in other words, move along a curve or something, I will always set my 2 points, the start frame and the end frame, first. Then I will go in and set my frame in the middle. Here's why I do that. Here's my frame at 0. Here it is at 30. Let me just, in fact, just change it. I think at frame 30, I want it aimed right in and rotated straight at us. So I'm happy with this new position. Create a keyframe. Now let me go to frame 15. F, 15, return. Notice it's showing me the position on the line. This is our motion path. This is a visual representation of our motion path. It's showing me the position where it would be at 15. And now what I can do is I can just kind of drop the object down, maybe move it over a little bit, create a keyframe, and you'll notice it not only creates that new keyframe, but it shows us that it's got to pass from this point to this point, then up to here. Now the reason I start with the first and last frames, then do the middle, is it gives you a much smoother move than if you tried to go 0, figure out a position at 15, then figure out one at 30. And there's one other really important rule here. This is Stranahan's first rule of keyframing. You want as few keyframes as possible in the scene. This is another reason for not creating all items, by the way. You want as few keyframes as you can possibly get in any one scene. If you can do a motion with 3 keyframes, or you can do the same motion with 6 keyframes, always do it with 3 keyframes. There's 2 important reasons. One is, quite frankly, the less keyframes you create, the less work it is for you. That sounds pretty good. I don't have to sell you on that one too hard, probably. But the more important one, really, is the more keyframes you have, the harder it is to fix things. And the way I think of it when we're talking about keyframes is, if I have an object that wants to start here at 0 and end here at 60, there's 2 ways I could do that. Keyframe at 0, keyframe at 60. The computer draws all the in-between frames. Here's another way I could do it. Keyframe at 0, keyframe at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth. Now let's say I could get those 2 motions to look exactly the same. Which one's better? Well, from the pure laziness standpoint, the one that I did with 2 keyframes wins. But here's the other problem. Here at 0, here at 60, if I decide at 30 I want to dip up here, the first motion, I've only got 2 keyframes, it's easy. Here at 0, here at 60, move to 30, put it up here. Now the object moves along that path. With my other one, if I create a keyframe out here at 30, the object will move along to frame 29, then miraculously teleport to this position at frame 30, then miraculously teleport back to here at 31, and continue on. So once you get into a lot of keyframes, if you want to change one thing about a motion, you just get into this problem where you have to change a lot more frames. So you want as few keyframes as possible. It makes for much better, smoother motion paths. Okay, let's go in and make a preview so we can see how this motion path looks. This is a good, solid 3 keyframe motion path. To make a preview, you go to this preview button, and you see these double triangles. This is the first time we've encountered them so far, but this means the same thing everywhere in the toaster. Hold down the left mouse button over this, and it brings up a window that you can move between. And you have 4 options here: make preview, play preview, load, or save. Let's start by making a preview here. And we have options here. It tells us our first frame is 1, last frame is 30. Frame step means will you see frames 1 through 30 as frame 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as opposed to a frame step of 2, which show you frames 1, 3, 5, 7, frame step of 3, 1, 4, 7, and so on. So again, you've got some options there. Typically, you'll want to go a frame step of 1. Now, what preview type does, you have two choices here, bounding box or wireframe. Wireframe will show you the complete object in the preview. Bounding box will just show you those bounding box outlines that objects turn into whenever you move them. Bounding box is much quicker, but we only have one object here, so let's just use wireframe for now. And it starts to make the preview, and you can see in the lower right-hand corner it's counting off the frames as it renders them. And then when it's done doing the make preview, it brings up the preview playback controls window. And this is now VCR-like controls to let you move a step at a time, forwards or backwards. You can play looping through the animation, forwards or backwards, or you can play once to the end. And you'll also notice on the looping modes here, you can change the frame rate automatically. 24 frames a second if you're going to film, or 3 frames a second for no apparent reason. The ones that you usually use here, by the way, would be 30, 10, or 15. Sometimes you'll want to do what's called animating to 2s or 3s. If you're animating to 2s, you'd have each frame of the animation take up 2 frames of video, and that way you render half the frames. I don't recommend it if you possibly can avoid it, because it makes the animations much less smooth. It makes them a lot jerkier. So typically, though, you'd want to use 30, 10, or 15, though. And let's just keep it on 30 here, because we're going to render it out 30 frames a second if we render this. And there's our preview. We just end preview to play it back. Stop playing it back. Now let's just change our motion path a little here. And let's go to this middle frame. Again, we can use this slider to move forward and backwards through the frames as well. It's another way of getting through our scene. And let's adjust this frame at 15. Let's move the logo up. Turn back on our Y, move it over. Create another keyframe. Again, just hitting the return key twice there. And now let's make a new preview of that. And there's another preview. Now, one thing that you'll notice here is that when I went to, let me just end that. When I went to preview, it comes up on play preview. So what you might do is, if you're moving pretty quickly, you might accidentally hit play preview and then go back and you'll play the preview. And what will happen is, if you've moved the object, for instance, I'll move it over here, create a new frame, you go back to preview, well, hey, it's not showing us the new motion path. Well, the reason is we didn't remake the preview. You have to make sure you go up and actually remake the preview there. All right, now let's talk about spline controls. Spline controls are very, very important because they give you a lot of control over your motion path. Let's define the term spline first. Spline is just basically a 50-cent word that means curve. And one thing that you'll notice about Lightwave motion paths is that they move in curves. In other words, and let's take a look at our window here. Let's go to our top view, and let's just center our logo. Click the center button. So now it's in the center of the view. And I'm going to use the comma key to back out a little bit here. What you'll notice is these are 3 keyframes here, here, and here. And you'll notice that it's moving in a curved path between those. It's not moving in a direct straight line. And if we move it over here, let's just move it a little more out of the way, create a new keyframe. Again, you'll notice it's moving in a curved path. It's not moving straight. Now, the reason Lightwave uses splines for its motion paths is because they look better and more realistic. But you can adjust those splines. And let's do that now. Let's go in and adjust the splines. The way we do that is we use the spline control button. And this will only show up on frames that are keyframes. So we have 3 keyframes in this scene. And let's go through it using these previous to next buttons. Here's a keyframe at 0. Here's our next one at 15. And our next one at 30. Now, our frame at 15, let's adjust this one. And you'll see, by the way, that on frames 14, 13, all the way back, there's no spline control button. But as soon as we go to a frame that is a keyframe, spline control shows up. So let's just click on spline control. By the way, the keyboard shortcut for that is S for spline. And we have 4 controls here: tension, continuity, bias, and linear. What linear does is it turns off the spline. It turns the curve off. And it makes the segment just a straight line segment. So the way that would look is, here we are at 15. You can see a curve here. We turn on linear. Turns off the curve. It makes it a straight line. And you'll notice that it makes it a straight line from keyframe 15 backwards to keyframe 0. And let me turn it back on normally. So here is the regular spline path. Now let's go to the next keyframe, frame 30. If we turn on linear here, you'll notice that it only affects the keyframe and the previous keyframe. It makes a straight line segment between, in this case, frame 30 and frame 15. From frame 15 to back to frame 0 is unaffected by that. If we want to make this a straight line segment, we have to move back to that keyframe, turn on spline, click linear, and there you go, straight line segments. Let's turn these both off to go back to a default position. Alright, and let's talk about these three other controls: tension, continuity, and bias. First one I want to talk about is tension. It's the first one on the requester, and it's the most important one as far as I'm concerned. Certainly the one you use the most. What tension is really good for is adjusting what I call ease in and ease out. It's a standard animation term, ease in or ease out. What that basically means is if you have a logo that's flying on screen, if you don't adjust the splines, what's going to happen is it's going to fly on screen, and at the end, bam, it's just going to slam into place. It's just going to come to a quick stop. Now, on the other hand, if you fly it into place and have what's called an ease in or ease out, a tension figure there, it's going to slow down as it parks in place. So tension is very, very good. And if you have a tension at the beginning of a animation's motion path and at the end, it's going to speed up at the beginning, pick up speed towards the middle, and then slow down again at the end. Very, very effective use of it. And again, it makes your logos look about 100% better. So instead of slamming into place, they slow down to park. So let's show you how we do that. Now, all of these spline controls here, tension, continuity, and bias, they're numbers. The default position is 0, and the useful values are between -1 and +1. A spline tension of +1, the analogy I use there is it acts like a red light. And again, the requesters work the same way they did before. And let's make a preview here, and you'll really see the difference. It acts like a red light. It slows down as it moves towards that keyframe, and it picks up speed as it leaves. So you see that, it slows down and then picks up. What that means is if you had a spline tension of 1 at the end of a keyframe, it would slow down as it approaches it. When you have a spline tension of 1 at the beginning of a keyframe, it picks up speed. It starts slower and then picks up speed. It accelerates. So again, that's the way it works. Now, let's change the spline tension. And if spline tension of 1 is a red light, spline tension of -1 is a yellow light. Because what happens when you approach a yellow light? You speed up to whip through it, and then as you move through the yellow light, you speed up again so the cops don't get you. And that's what happens here. It's the same thing. As you move through it, it goes faster. So -1, think of it as a yellow light, and you'll see also this adjusts the curve. Boom. You notice how it moves quicker through that position. All right, let's adjust that back to normal and talk about continuity. Continuity basically has one useful setting. It's -1, and that makes the spline discontinuous. In other words, instead of moving in this curved path, it moves in a straight line, sort of bouncy path. And this is really good for making a ball bounce off the surface of the ground or something. So let's set that. Let's make the continuity -1. Go to make preview, and boom. You notice instead of that smooth motion, with the spline discontinuous here, it just bounces. Now, let me just show you spline tension of 1. And if you come up with a good use for this one, write a book. Not too many useful settings for that. Okay, let's get rid of that. And talk about bias. Now, to be biased is to be for or against something, and what spline bias does is it adjusts whether the curve is before or after the keyframe that you have. It's pretty straightforward. If you have a +1, all of the curve comes after the keyframe. -1, all of the curve comes before. And what this does is it makes one of the segments a straight line segment, but instead of just making it a straight line and leaving the curve on the rest of the segment the same, it actually pushes the curve over to one side. So in other words, the curve is more pronounced after the keyframe, for instance, if you give it a bias of 1. So let's give it a bias. Let's go back to our regular position. Here's our normal position here. Here is our bias of 1. And you're going to see all the curve is going to come after the keyframe. It's a straight line segment from here, but the curve is more pronounced, and it keeps the same amount of curve. Bias of -1 puts all the curve before the keyframe. Now this can be pretty useful because this keeps the curve very smooth. If you just were to do a linear, the same thing there, what would happen is it would move into a motion path and then kind of cut away jerkily as it went from the straight line path to the curve path. With a bias, it keeps that curve very, very smooth. And this is very, very good if you need to get a camera, for instance, going through a doorway or a hallway or something like that, and then curve off. If you don't set the bias right, the camera is going to curve sort of into the hall. It's going to go through the walls there as it moves out through that position. Now, all of these controls can be adjusted interactively on Toaster 4000 and System 3.0, and this is tremendously handy. But make sure you understand how these things work. Otherwise, again, you're going to mess up your motion paths, and you really won't know why. The way you adjust these interactively is you hold down keys, and there's tension, continuity, and bias. So the keys are T, C, and B. Okay, now watch when I press the T key, it changes this window that's in the lower right-hand corner, and now this shows us our tension, continuity, and bias current settings for this keyframe. So we have tension of 0, continuity 0, and our bias is -1 where we left it. Now let's just move the mouse up here, hold the T, again I'm holding the T down, hold the left mouse button down, and now adjust left and right. Take a look, it's adjusting the curved path there, but also, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, it's also adjusting the number so we can see that changing. That's tension. Let's kind of get tension back to 0 here. Continuity, C, changing our spline continuity. And the one I actually think is the best one to use interactively, bias. You can really sort of adjust this curved path. And you can see, by the way, that you can set values that aren't -1 or 1. There are sometimes uses for that. So you can really adjust the path however you want to. Now, there's two other things I want to talk about. That's the use of the motion graph and use of the grid. Let's talk about both of those things now. And then we're going to do a little project where we're going to set up another scene and set motion paths for it. Let's start by talking about the grid. You see right here it shows our current grid size is 2.0, and that refers to how big each one of these grid squares is. 2.0 basically means 2 meters, and each one of these grid squares is 2 meters big. Now we can adjust that two ways. One, go up to Options. See where it says Grid Square Size? You want to change it to 1. Click in the requester, hit 1, hit Enter, and now it's 1. Also, you'll notice here we can change whether the layout grid is off entirely, a 4x4, 6x6, or 8x8 grid. And again, there's some reasons you might want a bigger grid or a smaller grid. It usually depends on the scene you're working on. I tend to leave the grid just where it is at the default most of the time. There aren't too many rules where you just have to change that grid size. Turning it off is sometimes handy, especially if you're going to make a preview and you don't want to see that grid. Since remember, the grid doesn't really render, sometimes you want to get it out of the way when you're actually making a preview. But changing the grid size is important for one big reason here, is that if we change our grid size, for instance, to 10, you'll notice it seems to zoom us out a little bit. That's because it wants to show us the whole grid. But let's zoom back in using the period key to do that. And then watch as I move the object. See how quickly the object's moving here if I move the mouse left and right? Well, let's adjust our grid size. And again, this going up to Options, clicking here, clicking 100. That's one way to do it. Let me zoom back in. You notice it's moving much, much quicker now. The same amount of mouse movement is moving the object a lot farther. Now the grid size is affected by the biggest object that you load into the scene. In other words, as soon as you load an object in, the grid size will automatically adjust to fit that object. If you have, for instance, a tsetse fly on the Titanic, the grid size is going to adjust itself to move the Titanic. And that's why when you set up your scenes, the best thing to do is to move the big objects first, then adjust your grid size down and move the smaller objects into place. And again, we'll show you that in a scene in just one second. Let's talk about the motion graph now. This allows you to change a lot of things about your motion path. And first, let me just adjust my grid size back to something human. 2 will work. Zoom back in. Okay, and here's the motion graph button. And motion graph is a keyboard shortcut. That's M for motion. And let's just go into motion graph, and it brings up this window. And let's talk about this. Again, more fun buttons for you to learn, but again, they're pretty straightforward. First off, let's actually start right here. You notice we have a create keyframe, delete keyframe button. Now these work just like the create and delete keyframe buttons that we've been working with out in the interface. There's no difference at all. In fact, a lot of these buttons you'll find are similar. And what you're looking at here is a chart of the animation over time. So this is frame 0, this is frame 30. You can see here's frame 60, so we're going in 10 frame increments here. Shows us our current keyframe. This is highlighted. So our current keyframe is 15. And it shows us the current value, and we're just looking at this on the X position. So this graph is showing us the object's X position over the course of time. Holding down the left mouse button here will bring up all of these things. We can look at Y position, Z position, our heading, pitch, bank. Notice our bank doesn't change at all. And then our scaling, X, Y, and Z. This affects size. And you can actually adjust these things any way you want. For instance, if I decide that I want the Y position at 15, instead of being 3.11 to be 2.5, I can just enter 2.5 and change it. Now the quick way to get into this requester is to hit N for numeric, which will put the cursor right there. I'll put it to 4 now, and it's adjusted our Y position. If you want to create a new keyframe, same way you create keyframes before, hit the return key, and I can create a keyframe at any position I'm at, or I can even enter a number, create a new keyframe at 20. There's a new keyframe at 20. If I want to delete that, hit the delete button or the delete key on the keyboard. So again, this works just the way it does in the outside real world here of the interface. Now, it's sometimes helpful to be able to look at your object's motion through these graphs. And you can also adjust it by using this chart. So I can grab it with the mouse. I can actually go in and grab one of these values and drag it wherever I want. This is handy with the motion graph for an object's motion, but you don't actually use it that much. We're going to come to the area where we use this a lot later when we talk about envelopes. But for right now, it's important to know that you can do this, but you don't really need to do it that much. The other things that are important here are things like clear motion path. This will get rid of the path completely. Load motion, which will load motions that you've saved. This means you could sit down one day and create 20 different logo motion paths, save them, and then when a client comes in, if they want a logo, you just say, okay, well, let me try this path for you. You load it up, show it to them. If they don't like it, you load another one up. Where do you save these motion paths? Well, look no further than save motion. This will save whatever motion path you have here, and you can give it whatever name you want. It saves it to a motions directory. Now, align to path we'll come to in a little bit. This is a very handy feature that will, since your path is curving, it will actually make your object align to that path and curve along with it. This means you could have a car, for instance, that follows the curve of the motion path, which is very, very useful. And let's talk about shift keys and scale keys here. Shift keys will let you shift all of these keys by a little bit. For instance, now we have our keyframes at 15 and 30. If we shift them by, let's say, 10 frames, now our keyframes will be at 25 and 40. You notice this 0 keyframe doesn't move, it doesn't shift, and that's because you always need a keyframe at 0. There always has to be a keyframe at 0. So therefore, it cannot shift to 10 because that would leave no keyframes between 0 and 10. Every item has to have a keyframe because otherwise it wouldn't be anywhere, basically. And again, you have some useful things here. Now, we'll be coming back to the motion window a number of times. We just want to give you an idea of the sort of things that you can do here with it. So let's exit out and let's start a whole new project here. Let's clear our scene. And we're going to go step by step and set up a little space scene. So with our scene cleared, that will clear out every object, and it will leave us only with a default scene, which is one light, one camera. There's always one camera, but it will leave us with just this one light and no objects. Now, When we're starting a scene like this, first thing to ask ourselves is, how long do we want the scene to be? Well, in this case, let's do a 4-second scene. We're dealing with video, it's 30 frames a second, so 4 times 30, it's going to be 120 frames long. Let's set our last frame to 120. Frame step of 1, fine with that. And let's go to the Objects menu and start to load objects. Now let's parent out and go to, parent by the way brings us to the last directory. Let's go to the space directory and load up a couple of objects here. First I'm going to load up random stars. We'll talk about what that is in one moment. Now let's load up planet. And let's load spaceship. And hit continue. Alright, here's what we have so far. Now, a couple things you're going to notice here. First off, this looks like basically a big ball of dots, and that's all it is. Here's what the random stars object is. All the random stars object is just a series of one-point polygons, or basically single-point objects. They have no depth whatsoever. They're just single points. As close or as far as you get to them, they're just single points. And they're in this big sphere. And this sphere is gigantic. How gigantic? Well, we can see that by taking a look at the grid size. Our current grid size is 100,000 meters. And let's go to the top view. And that means that this is 200,000 meters across. In other words, big. Now, here's the thing. With a grid size this big, what's going to happen is if we try to move small objects, such as a spaceship or even the planet, they're going to move far too quickly. And also, our camera is in the wrong position to properly use this space object. This stars object works best with the camera inside. This way, wherever you turn, since it's a sphere, you'll see stars off in the distance. That's the way it works. So, step 1, let's back off our view a little bit here. There's our camera. Check it, you can see it's highlighted. And one thing that you'll also notice is that the camera starts outside aiming at objects. And the way it works is, every scene when you load up objects, the camera figures out what the biggest object is and automatically moves back an appropriate distance to center that biggest object right in the middle of the view. So that's what it's done here. If we want to move the camera to the center, well, the quickest way is to reset it. So select Camera, Move, Reset. Boom, it's right there. And remember, if we want to keep it in that position, we have to create a keyframe. So, done. Now let's go to our camera view here. And so far, we're not seeing much. And let's go to our side view and kind of zoom in. By the way, remember this stars object's 200,000 meters across. This would mean this is one big camera. Forget your Panavisions. This is a giant camera. Now the thing is, the size of the camera here really doesn't make any difference whatsoever. The camera being as big as it is doesn't mean a thing, because the camera sees from an infinitely small point. What you're seeing here is really just a representation of the camera. And you'll notice that the camera changes size when we change grid size. So let's change our grid size here. Again, I'm using the keyboard shortcut of the brackets key, the key to the left of the P key. Back up a little bit. You see now the camera is much smaller than the stars object. I can make it much smaller. The fact is, it's really not going to make that much difference. The size of the camera really doesn't affect things. Although you might find that if the grid size is huge, sometimes objects will not show up. That's because the computer has difficulty dealing with the math that big. It's really just a problem with the computer. When you start to get that many digits, the computer just kind of freaks out and the circuits start to go crazy. So what you might want to do is lower your grid size and you'll see objects come back into view. And I'll show you that in just a little bit here. Well, let's take a look at this. Here is our spaceship object. And again, if we zoom out, there's our planet. And finally, there's the stars. You see how many times I'm having to hit the key to zoom in, by the way. Let's do this. Let's make our grid a little bit bigger. And the reason I want to do that is the first thing I want to move is the planet. So let's get the planet into position. We'll go to our camera view. We'll select Object. Now the question is, which object? Well, the object we currently have selected is the spaceship. By holding down the left mouse button over the Selected Items panel, we can choose between random stars, planet, or spaceship. Or we can use a keyboard shortcut to pick between these objects, and that's the up and down arrow keys, in this sort of upside down cross of arrows. If I hit the down arrow, it moves us forward through the list, up arrow moves us backwards. So I can pick planet by using that, and then let's just move the planet where we want. And we'll back it off. I accidentally hit the lights panel. That'll happen sometimes, by the way. If it does, just continue. If you're holding down the mouse, you move up here, you kind of accidentally hit a button. Fairly normal. All right, we'll put our planet in that position. I'm happy. Create a keyframe. Now, one thing you'll notice, by the way, is we're creating all these keyframes at 0. Since every item needs to have a keyframe at 0, what I usually use 0 as is, I'm thinking of it as a way I'm setting my set. I'm putting my world together at frame 0. So this is the starting positions for objects. You always need to have keyframes at 0. You can't delete them, but you can change them. So always start at 0, set up your world, and then move on from there. And finally, let's go to our spaceship. And let's kind of move that out. You see with the grid size set, it's moving way too quickly. So let's adjust our grid size down. And even lower. There we go. Okay, that's kind of working for me. Now, let's go to a top view here. And, well, what's going on? Where's our spaceship? Where are we? We're lost. Sad as it is, we're lost in our own computer. This is normal. This happens all the time. And again, that's why we use the center and reset buttons. So, let's get ourselves unlost here. We'll go to our top view, click on center, and it centers the current object because we have object chosen spaceship. There we go. We'll zoom back out. And we keep zooming. You can see there's a planet, there's a spaceship. There would be our camera. And let's just set up a little shot here. I'll kind of move it off this way. And I'm going back to camera view so I can see where the object is. So I want the spaceship to start off in the distance, maybe up from up above. Let's see, I'm moving it there, and I want it just off screen. So I'm moving it so I can see it just peeking out there. I want it not peeking out. Create a keyframe, and there's our keyframe at 0. Now this is a 120 frame shot, and so what I think I have to go to 120 next, because remember our rule, we start at the beginning, then go to the end, then set our middle keyframes. What I think I'm going to do is go to frame 120, because we always go to the frame first. And then what I want the shot to be is, the ship starts off in the distance, and then kind of flies right by the camera. That'll be a pretty effective shot, probably. So let's go to frame 120. I'll just hit F. Remember, that's the keyboard shortcut for current frame. You could also click there, type in 120, enter. There we go. We're now at frame 120, and let me just click on reset here. That will reset our spaceship to the middle, which is right on the camera, and now I can just kind of, the only reason I reset it there was just pure laziness. I wanted it back by me as quickly as possible. And now I kind of want it, I can see that the spaceship is right on top of us, basically. That's good. And let me go to a top view and recenter. And kind of zoom out. We're centering the spaceship, now zooming in. So I can see, here's the camera, here's the ship, it's moved behind the camera. Create a keyframe there. Let's go back to our camera view. And let's go to frame 60 now. Well, at frame 60, you can see that it's kind of not coming on. It's coming on that very, very straight line. Not hugely effective right there. So as I move the slider through, you can see Just moves right there. Well, problem one is I think I wanted it 120, a little bit lower. Something like this. So recreate a keyframe. Now let's move somewhere in the middle here. 50, 60, it really doesn't make any difference. I know I want it somewhere about in the middle. So let's go to camera, and let's move the object over and down a little bit. This way, at frame 50, the object will be here and then kind of swoop up towards us. So now, if we want to hold it in that position, create a keyframe. And let's see how this looks. Just make a preview. And here's the difference between wireframe and bounding box. Here's wireframe. See how quickly the numbers are ticking off? Okay, now let me just hit escape here to stop it from making the preview. And now we will do a bounding box. And you'll see, moves a little bit quicker. You see how much faster they're moving. Alright, there's our shot so far. Kinda boring. I mean, it's okay, there's nothing wrong with it, but it is kinda boring. Couple things. One thing is, you'll notice I didn't adjust the rotation of this object at all. And further, you'll notice, let me just center myself on it, that it's not really following the path at all. In other words, you've got this spaceship moving through space backwards, always aiming at the same point. Not exactly the science fiction realism we're looking for. What we want to do is we want to use a line to path. It's a perfect example of where we'd want to use it. We'll move out so we can see the motion path, and we will click on motion graph for this object. By the way, the motion graph is always for whatever item you have selected. And I will just click a line to path. Now, a line to path has a look ahead, which is in frames. And that's basically how far ahead does it determine where it should take its motion movements from. If you have a look ahead of 10 frames, it will say, okay, let's see what's 10 frames ahead. Oh, it's okay, it's starting to curve. Well, I'll start to curve now. And this is good for having anticipatory movement. I'm just going to leave it set to its default, which is 1. As soon as I click on Use Motion, you notice that the spaceship has turned around and is now following the path. And if I move it, I just sort of take a look at it, you see it's neatly following the motion path here. It's doing a pretty good job of following it. Let's go back to our camera view. And, by the way, this won't ostensibly make the shot any more interesting. It's just a little better. It at least doesn't look weird now if we were to render it. I think one reason I don't like this shot, and I'm just going to make an adjustment, and again, by the way, this is what you do. There's never a case where you just sit down, okay, I think I'll do a spaceship shot, you do it and you're done. You always kind of tweak it, you're honing it here. What we're going to do is, I don't like where it's ending up at 120. It's too low at this point. So maybe at 120, it's my prerogative to change my mind, and so I will just raise the ship so it's coming above the camera. And let's take a look at this. And so this is the process basically, is you set up shots, make previews, don't like it, try it again. One thing I do think I'm going to add, just to give the shot a little bit more visual interest, is I'm going to go to frame 50 here, and I'm going to give the object a bank rotation. This way it's following the path, but it's not really banking in at all. This way it'll move into the curve. And create a keyframe there. And just one more time. Yeah, I can see this is better already. Now, the shot's still a little boring, and one of the reasons is because we don't have any kind of camera movement. All the things we've been doing, keyframing objects, we can also do with the camera. So what I want to do is I want to add a camera move to this shot, and maybe the camera move I don't want to last the full length of the shot. Maybe I want it to move into place over 90 frames, for instance, and then for the last second to hold its position. So here's how we do that. First off, let's just take a look at that preview that just rendered. We'll go to play preview, and here's the way we're looking so far. And again, a little static, so let's just add that camera move. Now we want to start the camera. Obviously we need to set a frame for it at 0. So we'll go to frame 0. And now let's move our camera. So we'll select camera as our edit item. We'll move it up. You notice, by the way, the grid is moving, but the planet doesn't seem to be moving. That's because the planet is gigantic and it's way back in the distance. Let's rotate it a little bit. Maybe, a little something like this will work. Just move it a little bit more. Kind of rotating it up. Okay, I'm happy with that position. There's our position at 0. And now let's go to frame 90. Now, even though our spaceship has a frame at 120 in 0 and also in 50 in the middle, even though it has those for keyframes, our camera can have completely different frame numbers. So we're setting a 90 frame for the camera here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reset the camera back to its original position at 90. And I just did a reset here because if you remember, the camera was just at a reset position before. So that means it's going to move up into place at 120. So here's what we have for keyframes for the camera. Here at 0, here at 90. And you can see there is a bit of a move there. It's moving a little bit. And let's just take a look how this looks. Now again, this grid won't be rendering, but what you will see moving in the background is the stars will move a little bit, and of course the planet will move. And the whole thing will just have more of a feeling of motion. And again, the camera locks into place there at frame 90. Let's take a look at that so far. Boom. Now one thing you'll see there is, and the reason there's the boom, is that watch the camera here. Watch path, bang, just stops. So what do we want to do? Ease in, ease out. We want to adjust the tension of the camera's motion path so the camera slowly parks into position there. And the way we do that again is we go to frame 90, we're there already, click on our spline controls, and put our tension to 1. Now when we make our preview, what you'll see is the camera, instead of just banging into place there, will slow down. As it approaches frame 90, you're going to see it starts to move less and less. So it's a smooth ending for it there. And let's see how that looks. Works a little bit better. Now, at this point, there's a few other things we could do. If we wanted to adjust the lighting, for instance, we could animate the lights as well. In a scene like this, I don't think there's too much reason to do that. We don't need animated lights right here. But let's just take a look at what we've got so far, and I think you can see the way we set it up. It's a very, very orderly, straightforward fashion. If we want to go in and change things, we can still do that. We can go back and change things. One thing I want to add here to give the scene a little more interest is I want to get the planet in the background rotating a little bit. So the planet's slowly turning on its axis. So let's just go to frame 0. Select the planet. So we'll select Object, Planet. Okay, there it is at 0. I'm fine with that. It's at 0 degrees. That's fine. Let's go to frame 120, and I just want it spinning on its heading. And I will slowly rotate. I don't want too much. A little something there. Create a keyframe at 120, because that's the last frame. And now, you get a little bit of rotation there on the planet. And this is the point where I would actually start rendering frames. We've done enough now where we've set up the shot enough where, to me, at this point, I would just start rendering frames. I'm pretty happy with the way everything looks here. Let me do a couple things before we start actually rendering frames. First thing I want to do is save the scene. You can think of a scene as a recipe. What the scene does is it's basically a list that tells the computer what to load up, what objects, what lights, where your camera is, what motion paths each of the objects has. It tells you pretty much everything about that scene. Now again, I think of it like a recipe. The reason I say that is because just like a recipe, if I have a recipe and I bring the recipe over to your house, if I don't have the same ingredients at your house that I do at mine, we're not going to be eating. So that's where the problem comes in. If you have a scene file, it's a list that tells it load this object, load that object, move the camera this way, move the lights this way. However, if I were to take that scene file, just the scene file, bring it on a disk over to your computer, put it in, if you don't have the same objects, it's going to say, I cannot find this object, I can't find this image map, and you're going to be in trouble. So again, what the scene is, it's just a collection. Now this doesn't really come up as a problem, except in two cases. One case is if you try to transport a scene to someone else's computer, just remember, you have to have all the objects and image maps that are in that scene also, and those can take up quite a bit of room. The other thing is if you change where the objects are. If you have a scene loaded, and I were to move this spaceship that I loaded up in this scene into another directory, when I reloaded the scene, the computer would be looking for it, wouldn't find it, would say I cannot find spaceship. So I'd have to re-clue the computer where to look for the object. So this is the scene menu, and we can load, clear, and save scenes from here. Also set the first, last frame number and frame step. And also we have the scene overview menu, and what this does is it shows us all the objects, tells us these are objects with the O, random stars, planet, spaceship. Shows us we have one light and the camera, and it shows us where keyframes are. And you see this window here, it shows us this is frame 83 right now. Let's move it. Two of the objects, the planet and the spaceship, have keyframes at 120. The camera here is a frame at 90. And of course they all have keyframes at 0. You can also, this is our 50 keyframe for the spaceship. So it's kind of a nice overview that shows you where things are. The other buttons here are Shift and Scale keys. Okay, now Shift keyframes works just the same way as it did in the motion graph. If, for instance, we had a motion path that was 0, 10, and 20, and we shifted the whole thing by 15 frames, then our motion paths would be at 0, remember that doesn't change, 25, and 35. I had to do the math there in my head. Unfortunately, years of using computers have atrophied my ability to do math. Now, this will do it, however, the difference between this and motion graph is when you do a shift all keys in the scene menu, it does it for every single object, light, camera, everything in the scene, as opposed to just an individual basis. Now, what scale all keys does is it makes the scene longer or shorter. So for instance, our scene right now is 120 frames long. Let's say we wanted this whole shot to take place, instead of 120 frames, over 60 frames. We'd click on Scale. It warns us this will affect every motion and envelope. That's fine. Low frame is 0, high frame is 120. And scale frames, let's do it by 0.5. And now you can see, first frame is 1, last frame is 60. And the scene is now twice as quick. And if we were to make a preview, you'll see it's indeed twice as quick. If we wanted to double the length of the scene, all we would have done there is entered 2.0 instead of 0.5. Basically, it multiplies the length of the scene by whatever factor you give it there. To make a scene 4 times as long, you'd enter 4. To make it a quarter as long, you'd enter 0.25. So let's take a look at our new short version of the scene. You notice, by the way, it still goes to 120 here. That's because we went to make preview. You see our first frame is 1, our last frame is still 120. We can just change that to 60, and now we'll just get the part of the scene that we want. This is very, very handy because sometimes you really don't know how long you want a scene to be. This is particularly true in logos. You might try something, but then you can adjust it this way afterwards. So you sort of see how it looks at 90 frames long, for instance, and then just adjust it by 0.75 or something to make it as long as you want. Okay, this scene is pretty well moving. Now what I would do is, if I want to animate this out, is I would start to render a few frames. I would go through and just take a look at how this looks at various points. So I want to see how this frame looks. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the F9 key. It's a keyboard shortcut that renders whatever your current frame number is. So if our current frame is 12, if I hit F9, it's going to render frame 12. And I haven't adjusted any of our camera settings. One thing you'll notice here is that it's rendering kind of slowly. This is an 040 based Amiga 4000, and it's only rendering the top part here now. Then it's going to go on and render the second part. That's because it's rendering in medium resolution. You can see it renders one segment, then it takes it to the program monitor, then it goes on and renders the next segment. Well, often when I'm doing these quick checks, I just want a real quick idea of how the scene looks, so I will change my camera settings, my render settings. Here's the way the finished frame looks in the program monitor. This is a good idea. So again, this is a very good idea of how it's going to look. Let's just go to camera and make this low res. So we select low resolution instead of medium resolution. Hit continue, and notice it's only doing it one segment. It's just doing it all in one time, and it's a little quicker. Now the final image, we'll watch it as it renders down in program. Doesn't look quite as good. It's a little more jaggy, but it is quicker. It only took 16 seconds to render, and that's good because we just want something quick and dirty here. For a final render, we might end up using medium res. So then what I'd do is I would just go through and take a look at a few frames here just to make sure it's going to look decent. Right, there you go. Again, it looks jaggy because it's in low resolution, but we do get an idea of how it looks. Now, one thing about this scene, and it's just personal preference here, is the background color is black. Let's start to talk about that. The background color is black here because in the effects menu, let's go up to effects here, solid backdrop is chosen, and that backdrop color is black. It's one color. And all of our sliders here, these are sliders that you can drag, or you can enter the numbers manually. 50, for instance, 45. So the way it changes the sliders automatically. Set to black default. Now, for space scenes or something like that, you can use black as a background. Nothing wrong with that. Space tends to be a little dark. But there's another option you might want to exercise that makes these scenes look better. And by the way, this spaceship scene is actually pretty useful. Setting up space is pretty useful because lots of times your flying logos are flying through space. Watch television. It's amazing how often space is just cluttered with logos that are flying to and fro. And this is why, even a scene like this, you might use in a practical way with logos. So, solid backdrop is chosen. Let's turn that off. And now it brings up zenith, sky, ground, and nadir. The way this color gradient works is that you have two color gradations between these four values. One of them runs from zenith to sky, the other one runs from ground to nadir. Now zenith is the color directly overhead, directly above the universe. Sky is the color directly at the horizon line. And you can see that horizon line because it's where the grid is. So one color grade runs from zenith to sky, the other one runs from ground, which is directly below that horizon line, to nadir, and nadir is directly below, at the bottom of the universe. And you really do have two grades there. So one again runs zenith sky, the other one ground nadir. Now what that means is, and we'll set values that'll be inappropriate here first, if we set these two gradients, something like this, the defaults are zenith is this sort of blue color, sky is light blue, so it goes dark blue to light blue, ground is brown, and nadir is a sort of lighter brown. Let's just continue. We'll leave that where it is, and we'll just do a quick scene render. You'll see that these colors are completely inappropriate, basically, for in space, because it puts this dark blue, light blue, and then brown to light brown spread, which just doesn't work, as you can see here. Not exactly the thrill of 3D animation right there. Now, I don't even like these colors for most ground images. I just don't think they're that useful. But this is one way that they work. And you can see where that horizon line is. There's a break between the sky and the ground colors. But since the sky and the ground colors meet, if we set those two colors to the same value, in other words, if the sky and the ground are exactly the same, then it would appear like we have one big gradient that runs from zenith to sky, which is the same as ground, which then runs down to nadir. So basically, by having the two colors in the middle be the same color, you get a smooth grade. And this can be very, very useful. And for space, you often see a gradient which runs blue to black to black to blue. In other words, a very dark shade of blue down to black at the sky and the ground, same color, and then nadir would be a same dark shade of blue. And let's see how that looks. We'll just go to effects. We'll set up zenith. Set up a very dark shade of blue here. About 40 maybe. Sky, 0, 0, 0. You notice that will just make us black, straight black. Ground, 0, 0, 0. And nadir I'll set to about 25,040. That'll give our nadir slightly purplish tint here. Let's just hit F9 to render that. Again, this is going to render. This is a sort of standard graphics background. Very dark shade of blue or maybe purple down to black and back. And this will work very, very well for logos. Let's take away the way this looks on program. Now, one thing that this will do is by having a little bit of color back there, it'll give us a feeling of motion as the camera moves. Otherwise, with black, the only way we can really see the motion is through the stars and through the planet in the background. By having this slight color tinge, as the camera rotates up and down or as it moves, you're really going to get some kind of feeling of motion there, and it works pretty well. Let's do one other thing here. Let's take this animation that we have so far, which is this spaceship, show you how we might render it out, and then do something kind of interesting with it, and maybe a little more practical. So let's hit escape to exit out of here. I am pretty fine with the way this looks so far. I think it's renderable at this point. Let's go up and save the scene. And we will call it Spaceship. And there we go. There is our scene. Now we need to render it out. So let's talk about the different rendering modes you have, and to do that we're going to go back to the camera. So far you've seen the difference between medium res and low resolution, and you have 5 resolution choices here: super low res, medium, high, or print res. For video work, you're never going to want to use anything higher than medium res. In fact, you will never do that for anything except print work if you're doing something for a magazine cover or brochure, for instance. And even then, by the way, you can get away with murder in medium res. Medium res can look better than print res if you turn on the anti-aliasing settings. So let's talk about what the anti-aliasing settings are and what anti-aliasing is. Anti-aliasing is used to clean up jagged edges. For instance, if you had an object that had a straight line and you put it at a diagonal, because of the way the computer draws, it's just drawing these little dots, you might see a jagged edge. You might see the individual stair steps of the picture elements, the pixels of that image. That doesn't look very good. And so the way Lightwave used to do it, if you were used to older versions of Lightwave, is you'd render something at high resolution. And what it would do is it would basically render it at higher resolution and then kind of shrink it down. And by rendering it at higher res, it would then make the image look better when you shrunk it down, and it would get rid of some of that stair stepping, but not all of it. The way it works now in Lightwave is you go to medium res, for instance, and that's what I would use if I was outputting to videotape for the best quality. Is you go to medium resolution, and then you turn on anti-aliasing. Now you have 4 options for anti-aliasing: off, low, medium, or high. Once again, the rule here is pretty straightforward. Just use low. Medium resolution, low anti-aliasing with the default setting will give you an absolutely perfect looking image. And one example I can tell you of this is the Sequest television series, where everything is going out to film. They don't put it to video, they have to put it to film because the show might be broadcast as a motion picture overseas. Now, you'd think for something like that, well, they've got to be using high res or print resolution. Nope, they're using medium resolution, low anti-aliasing. You don't really need to go much higher than that. Now, the reason you'd go to medium or high anti-aliasing is when you get into features like motion blurring or depth of field focus. But for the average picture, low resolution is just fine. So we're going to leave it there. Let's talk about the other options here. Soft filter turns on a different way of doing the anti-aliasing. It produces a much softer edge look, and this gets rid of some of the flicker or jitteriness that's often associated with NTSC video. Adaptive sampling turns on, if you have adaptive sampling off, the sampling threshold here doesn't make any difference. Now let's talk about what the sampling threshold is and how that works. With adaptive sampling off, it's going to anti-alias the entire picture. Basically, it's going to look for edges, and any edges that it finds, it's going to just say, okay, here we go, here's an edge, I'll anti-alias it. That works, and it makes a very, very nice looking picture. The problem is it takes a long time. Adaptive sampling comes to the rescue here. Adaptive sampling means it will only look for certain types of angles, it will only look for certain types of differences, and the way it actually computes it is a color difference. And if it cannot find something below that, it just does an anti-alias. A setting of 8 anti-aliases most of the screen. Let's take a look at the way that looks. I will just leave the adaptive sampling where it is at 8, hit continue, and hit F9 to render this, and it will start to render. Now what we're going to do here is we're just going to let this render, and we're not going to do this in real time because it will take a bit of time here. We'll show you the first segment though, then we're just going to cut to a shot of the done rendering. But what you'll see here is it renders the picture, and now if we watch the interface screen, see it says searching for edges, and now it's looking for those edges. And it's going to do 5 passes here. See it says pass 2 of 5. If we had our anti-aliasing set to something other than low, it would do more passes, 9 or 13 if you're using medium or high resolution. That's the reason, by the way, you don't want to use medium or high, because it slows the machine down. The more passes, the longer it takes. So what it's doing is it's searching for the edges, finding them, and then cleaning them up. Now here's the final rendering, and it does look very, very nice. Now, let's take a look at our interface here though, and look in the lower right hand corner. It shows you the total rendering time, 2 minutes and 29 seconds. Let me just hit escape to get out of this screen. Let's go back and adjust our sampling threshold. And let's put it to, I'm going to set it to 30 and continue from there. And re-render. Now remember, the last frame was 2 minutes and 29 seconds. Let's take a look at how long this takes to render, and we'll take a look at the difference between the 2 frames. And you're going to see not a lot of difference between these 2 frames. And what we're going to do here is I've got one frame in one buffer, another frame in another buffer, and I'm just going to do a take to switch between these 2. This is just to show you the difference between the frames. That's the difference. That would be the difference right there. You're not seeing any difference? Don't adjust your set. There's really no effective difference, except 40 seconds a frame. And multiply that 40 seconds a frame over 60 or 120 or a few hundred frames. Soon you're talking about real time here. So this is a good way to do it. And the method I would use is I would start when you're setting up a scene. I would start by setting up your frame with the highest threshold you think you can get away with. Start at about 60 maybe. For safety's sake, I would usually go maybe 48. So I'll start at 48. If the image looks good, there you go. There's no reason to go lower. Try to find a frame where there's particularly evil angles going on there. You're looking for sharp sort of 45-degree angles. That causes the most problem for aliasing. But the idea there is you want that number as high as possible. So, now soft filter is a nice function. Soft filter doesn't really add that much render time. You might want to turn that on if you want to cut down the flicker. I usually leave that off for logos because it gives things too soft an edge. But these are your basic render options. There's one more render option that I think is pretty important, and that's if you're in medium res field rendering. If you're going to be rendering out to videotape or something like the DPS animation recorder, you might want to use field rendering, particularly for logos. What that does is it renders each frame, instead of just as one frame, as 2 fields. So each individual frame would have motion. You'll see the frames jittering all over the place as they render. When you animate them back, it looks a little smoother because you have 60 fields instead of 30 frames. And again, that looks very, very nice. So that's another option you might want to use. The only problem you get into there is if you don't have a spline tension on. So an object is, let's say, moving at one point and still at the next point, you're going to see a lot of flicker if you try to hold on that last frame, for instance. So again, it's a problem you'll get into on the last frame of an animation. You want a logo to move into place, hold there, it'll be flickering. So all you might want to do is turn field rendering off for the last frame. That'll work fine. Now let's turn field rendering off here, and let's just modify this scene. And what I want to do is I want to add another space fighter into this scene. And I want to have a very similar path, maybe following a little behind, still a slightly different path. Well, what we'd have to do then is load up an object, set a keyframe at the end, set a keyframe in the middle, da-da-da-da-da. We have to go through a lot of work. We don't like work. So there's a much easier way to do it. What we're going to do is we're already happy with this one spaceship. What we're going to do is we're going to use the clone function. So let's go to the Objects menu. The spaceship is chosen. And let's use a clone object. And we can pick the number of clones. We'll be conservative and just go with 1. You can put pretty much any number you want there. Now we have 2 spaceships, Spaceship 1, Spaceship 2. You can see the parentheses with the number so we can tell the difference between the 2. And now what we have here is 2 spaceships, And if we make a quick preview here, you'll see the shot looks exactly the same. Well, let me hit escape. One of the reasons the shot looks exactly the same is that both spaceships are in the same location. Here's Spaceship 1, here's Spaceship 2. We cloned them, so they're in exactly the same spot. But this is one of those areas where our shift key function that we touched on earlier can come in very, very handy. Let's take Spaceship 2, pick the motion graph for it, and now do a shift keys. And let's shift all of the frames by about, let's say 20. Now, this spaceship is moving along the same path, but in a delayed fashion. And when we make this preview, here comes one spaceship, there's the other one behind it. Again, same path, just following at a different rate. And in fact, we've shifted it by 20 frames. So if we were to extend this whole scene out by 20 frames, let's just make our last frame now, instead of 60, let's make it 80. Remake this preview. What you'll see is the one ship's going to move into place, move out of range, and then the other one's going to follow it. Now, if you wanted to further modify this, you could do things like take Spaceship 2, for instance, and change its bank here a little bit. I'll just turn on bank. So it's not moving in exactly the same path. There's a slight difference. Maybe even I'll move it up a little bit. But this is a real quick, dirty way of just getting a slight difference in the scene without a lot of work. I mean, this was pretty easy, and since we're pretty happy with the motion path and we want things to move in a squadron like this, it's very, very handy. You'll find that you can use this in logos, for instance, if you take elements. Like, let's say you have a star, and you want one star to fly into frame and then out, and you actually want a whole line of stars to follow. Just set up the motion path for one, then set up the other ones and give it a shift. So this will work pretty darn well. Let me just go back to the first frame and adjust it so it's starting from a different height, too. There we go. And let's just, since we're now shortening everything, let's make a wireframe preview, and we won't make you watch the whole thing. Here's the way that wireframe preview looks. Now, one thing you will notice here if you're being observant is watch the globe up here. By the way, this is why you make wireframe previews. Remember, we were all ready to render this out. Watch how the Earth suddenly stops spinning, thereby killing all the inhabitants of this planet, in theory. I don't think we want to do that. So what we need to do is we need to make sure this continues spinning. Quick way to do that, we'll just go to the planet. We'll go to its motion graph. And what we'll do is we'll just scale the keys for just this frame. So what we'll do is we'll scale it by, I don't know, about 1.4. That should bring this last frame out here. Let's do a plot frame limits. What this will do is it'll show us all the frames. We want to see between 1 and, let's say, 80. Okay, so it's now extending past 80. We can see that. If we clicked on automatic limits, it would automatically show us the frames within here. So that looks pretty good. This will keep going well past 80. And again, just make a quickie bounding box. Planet's still spinning. Everything looks good. Okay, now we've got something we can render. Everything looks good. No planets full of people are dying suddenly in the middle of our animation. The motions look good. We've got a camera move. It's not a boring shot. We're happy. So what do we do now? Well, we have two options. If you've got a Video Toaster 4000, you can actually save this as an animation. In other words, you can save an animation that you can play back from the computer directly. That's very, very handy, and the animations look just great. Now, if you don't have the Toaster 4000, you're going to need a single frame recorder to put the animations out to videotape, or you're going to need something like DPS's personal animation recorder, which also lets you do the same thing. It lets you record animations. Now, what we're going to do here, since we're on a Toaster 4000, is we're going to show you how to save the animations as a Toaster 4000 playbackable animation. New word there, playbackable. And we're going to be able to play that back. We're going to show you that. And we're also going to show you how you'd save frames so you could use it with something like the personal animation recorder or a single frame recorder. First, let's save the 4000 animation. So So what we're going to do is let's just take a look at that preview, by the way, it's created. See, everything's still moving. I'm happy. Okay. Let's go to the record menu. And up at the top here we have Save Anim File. Now, anim type, we have a number of options here. Super low res preview, low res preview, and medium res preview or medium res overlay. Now, of these four choices, the one you'll probably use the most is low res preview. Super low resolution preview is quick, and it makes a quarter screen preview. It's a quarter the size of the screen. And what I would use this for is just doing client previews or just to get a quick check of the way the animation looks. Super low res is very, very fast, but on the other hand, it doesn't look very, very good. So, again, it's something that I would use just as a quick and dirty, I want to see how this actually looks rendered. Now, for final output, I would tend to use something like low resolution preview. Low resolution preview lets you move everything on the screen. The camera can move. You can have a lot of action going on. And it looks pretty good, particularly if you set your anti-aliasing settings right. Medium resolution preview looks great, but you're restricted because of the amount of computing power. You're restricted to only a quarter screen of movement. So in something like this, I'd probably have difficulty doing it as a medium resolution preview. I'm not sure it would work, although again it might. I think it would have trouble when the spaceship flew close to the camera. Now, medium resolution overlay here is totally different. What that would do is it would overlay the animation on top of video. In other words, when you called the animation up from Switcher, it wouldn't have a background. It would just put whatever's being animated over on top of video. And again, this looks great, but you're restricted to a quarter screen of movement. So let's go to a low resolution preview. And lock palette, what this does is it lets you lock the palette so it's not changing. The palette's the number of colors and which colors are being used during the animation. And by locking the palette, you don't have any color changes whatsoever. I'm not going to turn that on now. I'm just going to leave that at its default. And loop anim is handy. This lets you loop your animations. So in other words, the animations will play over and over. And you can also, in the lower super low res modes, begin your loop at a later point. And this can be really pretty handy for things. Let's say you had an animation where a logo flew into frame, started spinning around, and you wanted it to keep spinning around for the rest of the scene. So for instance, here at 0, at frame 30, it starts spinning, and it spins over 60 frames. So it's here at 30, and it's back in the same position at 90. What you'd do is you'd start the loop at 30. So when you ran the animation, the logo would fly into position, start spinning, and just keep spinning there forever. With something like this, we don't need the spaceships to keep coming on and on and on endlessly. That would be a little tiresome, so we'll just leave it right where it is. And we click on Save Anim. Now, this will bring up a list of your frame store directory. And what you need to do here is you need to give it a name. But most important, even more importantly than giving it a name, you need to give it a number. And what it will do is it will automatically look for the next empty number, in this case 119. Just make double sure that there's no number that's the same as the number that's chosen in the file requester. In other words, if it says 119 down here, make sure that there's no 119 up this way. Because if there is, you're going to get into real trouble where what's going to happen is as the frames are tried to be loaded back from Switcher, it's going to see two similar numbers. It won't be able to load each one of them. Each animation or frame has to have its own distinct number. Okay? That being said, let's 119, this is unique, so that's fine. Let's call it space. And I'm going to leave the .anim in there. The reason I'm leaving the .anim in there is so I'll know it's an animation. And it's changed the resolution to match the anim type. You remember before we had medium resolution chosen from camera? Well, let's change it to low resolution. And we'll keep the anti-aliasing on, we'll keep the adaptive sampling on. And now all we need to do is render. It shows us the first frame we're going to render is 1, the last frame is 80, and the frame step is 1. In other words, it's going to do frames 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's perfect. Frame advance, this is the important one here. Make sure it's automatic. If it's manual, the computer's going to render a frame, wait for you to hit enter, then render the next one. You just want to set it and forget it, basically. Now, the other thing I would do is I would check the menu down below here. We're in, well, 376 by 240, that's low resolution. The anti-aliasing is on and it's low. The anim save is on. That's all good so far. If we click enter, you can see it's starting to render. Now the toaster also has an Easy Anim function. It's the button right below Make Preview. The Easy Anim function is very, very handy in some ways, it would seem. I don't like Easy Anim. And the reason I don't like it is because it defaults your anti-aliasing setting to 8. And it really doesn't give you a lot of the control that I want over it. It's not too much more work to go through this and to get everything set the way you want it. And with the anti-aliasing setting defaulting to 8 every time, this is much, much quicker. So take the time to learn this procedure, and you just want to make sure you go through the steps. Here's a list of the things you want to check when you're going through this. First, make sure that you have the right frame numbers. Make sure you're starting and stopping at the proper frame number. You generally want to start at frame 1, not frame 0. Frame 1 is the first frame you want to animate. Second, make sure you're in the right resolution. Make sure you have the right anti-aliasing settings. Then finally, when you go to render, make sure that you have automatic turned on. You don't want manual. Right, now, if you take a look at this animation, you'll see this is how the 4000 playback looks. And again, it looks pretty nice there. Okay, now let's set up this if we were going to be animating to a single frame recorder or something like the DPS personal animation recorder. What we'd want to do instead of saving the animation is we'd want to save individual frames. We go to Record menu, and we have two options for that basically. There's Save RGB and Save Frame Stores. Now the difference between an RGB image and a frame store is that an RGB image is essentially an Amiga IFF24 format graphic image. And it's a little more versatile because most programs that are graphics programs in the Amiga can read IFFs, although not all of them can read 24-bit or 16 million color IFFs like the toaster produces. But if you save them as RGBs, you'll be able to be read in most programs like Art Department Pro or Image Effects. Frame stores can be read in less programs. There's a few programs, including both ones that I mentioned, that can read in frame stores. But in general, you're a little safer if you save images as RGB frames. Now, what you might want to do is check with the manual that came with your single frame controller software or your single frame recorder. For instance, as I mentioned, the DPS personal animation recorder, and read the instructions there and what they recommend. Now we're going to be saving these out for the animation recorder, so I'm going to save them as RGB images. If we're saving as frame stores, almost exactly the same method. What we do is click on Save RGB Images, and this will bring up a directory. In this case, it's our frame store directory. We can either save the images here, or if you have another directory defined already, you might want to save them into another directory. For this case, we'll just save them to the frame store directory, and we'll just give them a name. And the name can be anything. We'll call them Space RGBs. And we're virtually done. That's basically it. Now we have to do the same thing that we did before when we set up the animation, which is click on Render, make sure we're in automatic mode. First frame 1, last frame 80, that's good. Anti-aliasing is on low. The thing I want to change here, and I can see already the problem is, I don't want to do this in low resolution. Since I'm going to be putting these out to videotape, I can go medium resolution, low anti-aliasing, and the frames are going to be a higher resolution, look a little better. So let's just cancel out of there. Go to Camera, Medium Res. I want low anti-aliasing and adaptive sampling on. The other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to turn on field rendering, and that way we'll get that field rendered effect, where, as I said before, renders 60 fields per second instead of 30 frames. So we'll turn on field rendering, and medium resolution, low anti-alias, RGB save is on, everything else is off, looks good. We just click OK, and it starts to render. Now let's take a look at the way this animation would look rendered out to the DPS personal animation recorder, and it looks a little something like this. And again, I think you can see some of the resolution differences. In fact, let's just do a switch here between the animation recorder and the Toaster 4000 playback, and you can see a little bit of the difference there. I want to give you just one more hint here. We've gone through an entire project from start to render. Let me give you just a couple of other hints. Before you set anything rendering, one thing I would do is I would always go up and just save the scene. In many cases, that means resaving it. Well, it says it already exists, or I want to overwrite it, sure. But again, I would always save the scene. Also, if you've changed the surfaces at all, just do a Save All Objects. This is going to save any of the surface attributes we've changed. We didn't change any here, really. We've left the surfaces as they are. But it never hurts to get in the habit of doing a Save All Objects and a Save Scene. Another thing that we can do with this scene, the one that we've created already, is just use one other feature, replace objects. Now, replace objects takes any object you select and replaces it with any other object that you choose. And this can be very, very handy. Here's an example. These spaceships that we're using here are kind of not great looking spaceships. But the reason we use them is because they have very, very small polygon counts, so it's easier and quicker for me to move around and quicker for it to make the wireframe previews. Well, that's the case a lot of times. You're working with a big complex object. You don't want to take up a lot of space when you're setting up the scene, but on the other hand, you want the scene to look good when you render it. Replace objects is really handy here. And for instance, you can see that each one of these spaceships is only 252 polygons. If we do a replace object, we will replace spaceship 1. That's the object we have selected. So we click replace, and just replace it with the space fighter. And now we'll go to spaceship, and you'll notice it used to be spaceship 2. Now it's just spaceship because there's only one spaceship now. We'll replace that with space fighter again. And now what we've got is, let me just move forward in the scene a little bit. Now we've got two different spaceships. These are a little more detailed ships and much, much better looking, I think, than the original ones that we had. One hint you might want to do is, when you're making objects, if they're complex, make two versions. One simple version, one complex version. Set up the animation using the simple version. Then when you're ready to render, do a replace objects, replace the simple object with a complex one. You saved yourself a lot of time, a lot of work, and the animations will look great. One other thing I could do here is replace these spaceships with logos, for instance. And the animation you're seeing now, all I've done is I've just replaced the two spaceships with two different words, the word flying and the word logos, and it's exactly the same scene, just with objects replaced. We're about out of time on this tape. We hope you enjoyed the tape, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to write to us at the address you see on your screen now. Let me just finish up by reminding you that these are basic skills. These ways of setting up a scene are the kinds of things you're going to do over and over and over again. And using these attributes and the sort of method of working, setting up the scene in a clear, orderly fashion, and then going through and doing test renders, and finally rendering the whole scene out, these are the things that you can do time and time again in Lightwave. We hope you picked up a lot from this tape, and we'll see you next time. Till then, I'm Lee Stranahan. Thanks a lot.